Night fell heavy over Sandringham, and the house breathed the kind of silence that makes old floorboards remember. In a lamplit study, a cedar box sat open, its velvet trays still holding the soft imprint of a life now gone. The label read, Her Majesty's Private Effects. When Camilla's private request reached the king that certain pieces be set aside for her own family, the air shifted. Duty, memory, and love collided. And before dawn, a decision would be made that no one thought Charles would ever make, because this wasn't about jewels. It was about the crown's soul, and who had the right to touch it next. The Queen's legacy, the weight of a room. There are rooms in royal houses that feel like people. The late Queen's sitting room was one of them, warmed by decades of lilac stationery, corgi sketches, and a small brass bell that had called in tea since the war. The things she left behind were not measured in carats or catalogs. They breathed with the residue of Christmas addresses, red box ink, the scent of peat fires from Balmoral summers, and the careful habit of a woman who pressed tissue between every page and promise. Some items were crown property, destined for history. Others were her private keepsakes, their value a quiet, stubborn thing that can't be insured. Charles knew the difference because his mother had taught him to feel it, not count it. A diary bound in blue, its clasp rubbed smooth by thumbs that steadied a nation. A simple scarf, folded with the neatness of an old habit, still carrying the faintest hint of her perfume. The Braemar brooch winked from a tray, a little river of diamonds that remembered laughter on chilly Highland days. Nearby, a personal letter, creased at the corners, with a hand that leaned to the right, steady, precise, ending in that unmistakable E. These weren't trinkets. They were waypoints of a life in service, the compass points of a rein that anchored Charles when the seas rose too high. In private, he touched nothing, without pausing. One heartbeat for memory, one for gratitude, one for the responsibility that now lived in his bones. He could hear her voice in the ritual of it. We do not simply own, we steward. We do not simply keep, we keep faith. Around him, the machinery of inheritance hummed as it must. Curators listing, courtiers noting, archivists whispering like librarians around a sleeping king. William sent a quiet message about ensuring that anything tied to national memory would meet the public again, someday, behind glass and light and schoolchildren's footsteps. Anne, practical, piercing, insisted that what had been hers as daughter should remain hers as daughter, not lady in residence to the state. Catherine moved softly, asking the kinds of questions that protect the people who aren't in the room. That night, the cedar box stood open longer than any other. It held a handful of things that the Queen had kept nearest her. Letters, small gifts, a locket with a faded photograph of two children holding a spaniel on a lawn that was more clover than grass. Nothing in that tray would make a headline. Everything in it would make a heartache. And so when a private request arrived, polite, formal, specific, it did not land on paper. It landed on a nerve. The palace has rules for almost everything, including what happens to the things that outlive us. But rules are one thing, relationships are another. And even in houses of state, families are families, which is why what came next did not feel procedural. It felt personal, and it was about to pull an old, buried splinter straight to the surface. The request, a line crossed in velvet gloves. It was framed with care. No demands, no thunder, just a note, then a conversation, then the kind of clarification that signals mind already made. The Queen Consort, it was said, believed a few of the late Queen's privately held pieces could be sensibly rehomed, shared thoughtfully with members of her family who, while not Windsors, had supported the monarchy in their own quiet ways. One item mentioned was a small, discreet brooch with personal associations to Balmoral. Another, a pair of pearl drops the late Queen wore on rain-bright Sundays, light tapping gently at the windows. Not the great historic sets, not the coronation pieces, but things with the warmth of hands on them. The words were tidy. The implications were not. To those who loved the late Queen, the request felt like moving a boundary stone by an inch. It's only an inch, said the argument. Yes, replied the room, but it is the stone that marks the field. Palace walls don't merely keep people out. They keep meaning in. And meaning is a fragile thing when stretched across bloodlines, marriages, divorces, and centuries of ceremony. Behind closed doors, polite phrases grow barbs. Entirely understandable meant no, but we will not embarrass you. A matter for the king meant this will be remembered. Sensitive meant this could break something we can't mend. The household, which prefers its crises bland, went a little pale. Decisions about objects are rarely just about objects. They are about stories, and who gets to tell them. Chatter moved like mist. A private secretary stared longer than usual at the ink drying on a briefing. An equerry misjudged a joke and let it die midair. In the corridor, Anne's footsteps quickened, steady as a drum. She had been the queen's gold stick, guardian in ceremony, guardian in spirit. If anyone knew the difference between rightful claim and overreach, it was the Princess Royal, whose loyalty is woven from tweed and spine. William didn't raise his voice. He never does when it matters. He asked 2 questions only. Is this consistent? And is this right? Consistent with the rules that bind them, rightly applied without fear or favor, right for the family that must, above all, look like what it says it is. Catherine listened more than she spoke. When she did, it was the gentlest case for restraint. What we pass along should make our children proud, not put them in rooms, explaining why. Meanwhile, the king was quiet. It is a misconception that quiet is indecision. Charles's silences are work, a mind walking through a maze, marking turns with chalk. He knew the argument for generosity. He also knew the geometry of the crown. How easily one kind turn can distort the shape of an institution, not built on kindness, but on continuity. By evening, the request had grown a second edge, mention that a piece might be loaned into a private setting beyond Windsor blood, perhaps for a christening or a wedding, just once, just among family. Words like loan and family carry warmth. They also carry loopholes. In old houses, doors left just on the latch invite wind, and so a tidy note became an untidy problem, not for the vaults, but for the vows. Because if the objects that held the late queen's private heart were to cross the threshold into new hands, what exactly would stay inside these walls? And what would they still be to each other once that line was crossed? The confrontation. Duty has a voice. It happened in the picture gallery, beneath portraits that have watched better days and worse without blinking. Charles did not summon dramatics. He arrived on time, with a folder closed, his ring turning once, then still. Camilla came prepared with calm, the armor that has carried her through decades of cameras, columns, and the kind of comparisons no one can win. Around them, the gaze of history, guilt, and patient. Let's be clear, he began, almost apologetically, as men do when the next sentence will not be. There are 2 kinds of things, the things that belong to the crown and the things that belong to my mother. Both, in their way, belong to the country. It was not a rebuke. It was a map. She answered with the sense that has often steadied him. Practical, measured, unflustered. She spoke of families and kindness, of blending old traditions with new realities, of recognizing those who stood by at quiet tables where cameras never go. Her voice, when soft, is convincing. It has disarmed fiercer storms than this. She did not ask. She reasoned. She did not push. She proposed. But the line she drew on the air crossed a border he could not redraw. Your family? He said, and the 2 words hung there. Not unkind, not sharp, simply exact. Mine carries this house. Yours has supported you and therefore me. I am grateful, truly. But gratitude is not title. Kindness is not claim. He didn't raise the past as accusation. He has learned too much for that. But as geometry again. The angles by which a monarchy keeps its balance. She asked if a loan was really so dangerous, if a brooch on a lapel far from a balcony could unmake anything that mattered. Everything we are, he said quietly, is a chain of small, sensible exceptions that other people call precedents. The folder opened. Inside, a short note written years ago in a hand that had steadied whole parliaments. Not a directive, not a codicil, just the kind of sentence mothers leave sons who will need them most after they are gone. Keep what is mine where my heart kept it, in the family that is also the work. He didn't quote it as law, he offered it as memory. Which in this house is stronger, he told her then, as gently as a man can tell a woman he loves something she will not want to hear, that there would be no loans beyond Windsor blood, no gifts beyond the agreements already signed, no quiet rehoming of pieces that had lived closest to his mother's pulse. He added what the crown requires from every human relationship around it. Limits. And then he did what the title demands when the conversation fails. He acted. Access to the late Queen's private apartments would be limited for a time, no slight. Simply space. Decisions about the personal collection would be handled by a small committee of family and archivists. Anne would chair, with William consulted as heir, Catherine for the early years projects that would display some of those tender things to the public in due course. The winter plans at Sandringham shifted. Arrangements made for the Queen Consort to spend a portion of the season elsewhere, on the thinnest of pretexts, the kind that spares faces if not feelings. "Is this necessary?" she asked, the calm cracking a hair's breadth, like ice over running water. His look answered all at once. Necessary is what stops cracks from spreading. No doors slammed. Palaces do not slam. They close. Softly. Completely. And in that softness was the shock. The king had set a boundary, not as husband, but as sovereign, and made clear which voice speaks last when the two disagree. The leak, the lesson, the long winter. It is a truth of royal life that nothing stays where you put it, least of all a secret. The story did not break with details, it broke with feeling. "Tension over the late Queen's private effects," said one columnist with a gift for understatement. Another paper left subtlety at the door. Charles draws line. The usual chorus tuned up. Those who see every boundary as cruelty. Those who see every kindness as weakness. But beyond the noise, ordinary people read and felt something simpler. The ache of families trying not to come apart when someone irreplaceable is gone. William's circle made no comment, which is a comment. His schedule added a visit to a museum conservation lab. Cameras caught him running a careful fingertip along the edge of a frame as a curator explained how you keep old things from turning to dust. Catherine's engagements found her in a school, library speaking about stories we inherit, and the duty to tell them truthfully even when they hurt. Anne did what Anne always does, worked. A ribbon cut, a trophy handed, a barn inspected, loyalty expressed in miles and mud. Within the house, corridors learned the new map. Courtiers love nothing more than policy. They got it, typed on good paper. The late Queen's private things remain within Windsor blood, loaned typed on good paper. The late Queen's private things remain within Windsor blood, loaned only to royal houses for public exhibition and never for private use outside the line of succession. Requests of an exceptional nature would go to a family committee chaired by Anne. Provenance logs would be digitized. Photographs of significant keepsakes would be archived for the nation. It was neat. It was final. It was, quietly, new. In the days after, the palace attempted the old alchemy, turning drama into duty. Briefings emphasized stewardship, continuity, education. A senior aide used the word custodianship so often it began to sound like a hymn. Even so, something colder moved through the air. Access was adjusted. Rooms where Camilla once came and went on instinct now involved a call ahead. Her private secretariat's clearance for the late Queen's apartments was paused during cataloging. No grievance, just process. The King's diary, normally braided closely with the Queen consort's, diverged, publicly to cover more, ground, privately to create space. And then came the glimpse that made the headline make sense. A long lens caught the Queen consort at Ray Mill House, the honeyed stone of Wiltshire behind her, and a single overnight bag in hand. Not exile, she owns the place, fills its kitchen with laughter and dogs, but not the palace either. The caption, writers did not restrain themselves. Kicked out? The palace did what it always does with bad phrasing, ignored it into exhaustion. But within the family, the language was plainer. There would be a cooling period. The committee would do its work. Feelings would settle where facts had been set. Public reaction split along familiar seams. For some, Charles had done what sons do, protected a mother's memory with a spine they recognized as hers. For others, it looked like ingratitude toward I, a woman who had stood beside him through the world's longest apprenticeship. Phone-ins hummed, columnists preened, and social media did what it does best, turn nuance into teams. Meanwhile, donations spiked at two different places: a children's literacy charity patroned by Camilla, and a conservation trust tied to the late Queen. The British have a way of arguing with their wallets. Inside the house, the lesson clarified. William's staff drafted plans for a small traveling exhibit, The Queen at Home, to show ordinary objects that made an extraordinary life feel human. Pencils whittled to nubs, a battered recipe card for drop scones, a faded scarf with a stitched E in the corner. Catherine suggested a short film to accompany it, voices of those who had known the Queen reading letters in quiet rooms. Anne insisted on a section titled Mended and Kept, things repaired rather than replaced, because that was the woman and thus must be the story. For Camilla, the winter became a study in posture. She kept engagements with the professionalism that has always been her armor, reading to school children, meeting women who had survived the worst days of their lives, visiting a hospice where the windows framed the tender, terrible dignity of endings. Cameras found her kindness easily, they always have. But when microphones slipped a final question into the air, "Do you feel you've been treated fairly?" she answered it the only way a queen consort can when the king has decided, with a smile that meant next question. Privately, she wrote, not to plead, the moment for argument had passed, but to place her own marker in the record. She told Charles she accepted the policy and its purpose. She told him she would not be the reason the country argued about things when it should be looking at service. She did not apologize for wanting to recognize the people who had carried her when the road was ugly. She simply promised to do it. In other ways. In return, he telephoned, and the first sound was not a title but a name. They spoke for an hour about gardens and dogs and a charity gala in spring. At the end, he said softly, "Thank you." Which in that house can mean, "I know what this cost you. What of the courtiers who live by reading weather?" They drew the chart most of them secretly prefer: clear lines, fewer surprises, and a family that looks more like an institution than a storyline. What of the historians? They nodded at precedent set and precedent avoided. And the rest of us? We did what people always do when a famous family becomes, for a moment, recognizably human. We chose a side and then went back to the washing up. Winter kept to its business. Policies bedded in. The catalog grew, line by accurate line, into a memory that can't be sold, gifted, or confused. And yet the human truth sat beside the neatness like a cup on a saucer that doesn't quite match. Love lives in houses where rules must win. Sometimes rules must speak louder than love. Sometimes love is the thing that lets rules be spoken, and when the frost finally lifts, houses remember. The question is not whether this one will forget. It is what it will do with what it has learned. In the end, no doors slammed, no titles changed, no crown trembled. A boundary was drawn, not across a map, but across a memory, and the king kept it. The late queen's private things stayed where her hand had kept them, within the family that is also the work. Camilla stepped back without stepping away. Azahir? Winter at Ray Mill is not banishment, only weather. And yet something real shifted. A sovereign chose stewardship over sentiment, and did it in a voice that sounded at last entirely his own. Spring will come. Exhibitions will open. Children will press their noses to glass and learn that history can look like a pencil stub and a scarf. And somewhere in a quiet room, a cedar box will close with a soft click that means kept. Not because it is precious, but because she was.